Best of r/malicious compliance episode 107. Subscribe for edit videos daily. I once worked front desk at a public pool. It was horrible, but one interaction stands out, both for how malicious my compliance was and for the fallout. Our swim team had just launched and parents came to sign their kids up for every single thing they could because it meant after school activities and freedom. Yay. My responsibility was the form. First, I had to help design the form, because the design the city gave us, made by a woman who was making more than minimum wage as a pool desk caddy, was not enough for my boss, and my dumbass let her know I could make Ms. Word sit up and do tricks for e-cookers. Once the form was approved, and by then I was taking proofs home to burn as catharsis, my job was to make sure that every single parent had signed the form and paid their fee. Enter Daddy T. His daughter was on swim team, and he had this charismatic grin and confident way of speaking that immediately put my alarm bells into danger. Will Robinson. He was a little too smiley, a little too happy, and vaguely familiar. There was something kind of off about him. I wasn't sure what it was, but it made me want to be as far under his radar as possible. Unfortunately, while his kid was signed up for swim team, he still needed to sign the form and pay for her entry, which meant I needed to interact with him. Most females, and not too few males, know the gazelle on the felt feeling. Something is off. Something had the hair on the back of your neck standing on end. You don't know what it is, and the rules of social interaction demand you keep your mouth shut and play nice. The guy spends a few minutes of charismatic smiles. I had never seen teeth like that outside of Channel 10 news presenters, acting like he's having trouble reading the form. I designed the form over the course of multiple painful weeks and know you would have to be severely brain damaged to have issues understanding it. My boss had me dumb it down to the point that a kindergarten student could know where to scribble a name approximation. And this guy is well spoken and clean cut, and he's got the sharpest, and most familiar gaze I've ever seen. I cannot think of any reason for him to be this obtuse honestly, and I begin to suspect he is hitting on me, which for multiple reasons has me creeped out by several orders of magnitude. I just want this guy to go away. Finally, after agonizing minutes of him struggling with a form that a 2-year-old could sign, he hands it back and says, still with that same confident, charismatic smile, read it to me. I was at a low point in my life. I hated every single thing about my life. I had untreated PTSD, and the thought of anyone hitting on me made me want to go scrub a layer of skin off. The realization that this guy had me pinned to a desk I could not leave until he signed the form made me want to punch him. But I needed this job, and my boss would grind me into flour and turn me into concession stand specials if I even pretended to stand up for myself. So instead, I complied. I shifted into happy customer service mode and I read him that goddamn form. I summarize legalese. I dumped things down from kindergarten to preschool. I did it all with the sweetest smile I could muster and tried to be about as asexual as the desktop computer right next to the counter window. I made it a point to be the most cheerfully helpful person, and hoped that somehow this would translate to go the fuck away, and it worked. He signed. He left. I breathed a sigh of relief. Until next week, when the form had to be supplemented by the sign-in sheet and the whole fucking song and dance repeated itself. He asked me to read him the goddamn sign-in sheet. And I did. With a smile. That couldn't have been more forced if he had a gun to my head. At this point I was heaping lit coals on his head and practicing my obtuse as fuck face. I might be a captive audience, but I would be damned before I'll let him know he got to me. I maliciously treated him like any other customer. I hated to see him arrive, and when he left I cheered. And this went on for weeks, because every session the boss would need a new form signed. And every session that guy asked me to read it to him, and I managed it by channeling my inner robot. I even began highlighting his daughter's name. What kind of shit dad forgets his daughter's name? And our interactions became a game. Him trying to get to me refusing to be got. It almost felt like chess. Then it came time to distribute the swim team gear, and that brought a whole new set of forms, which meant that guy asked me to read him every single one of them. And just when I'm contemplating leaping out the nearest window while doing full body silkwood decontum, he suddenly meets my eyes and this layer of pretense I hadn't ever noticed drops away. He has tears, literal tears, in his eyes, and he says thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. See, the entire time I had been maliciously complying with him, by being the best reader ever, I'd been struck by how familiar he looked. But I didn't ever really watch the news. I just sat and read books while my parents watched it instead. Which is why I didn't recognize our local weatherman when he began bringing his daughter to swim practice. It's also why I didn't know why he had recently retired. He'd been diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor, you see, and they'd just finished a round of surgery and chemo to save his life that they weren't sure would actually work. His odds sucked. It really had been all over the news. They even gave him a really nice, heartbreaking sound off that I never watched because of my own depression and isolation. I found it on YouTube later. It's the kind of thing all of us would pray someone do without memory. He thanked me, because ever since his surgery, his ability to function had been compromised. He could mask most of the damage with his charisma and training, and usually could fake it till you make it with the best of them, but he'd lost a lot of his capacity to read. It was a struggle he'd obviously never faced before, and it frustrated him that after all his college education and decades being the face of the local weather, he suddenly couldn't even read a basic form for his daughter's swim team. And he was so thankful, he was crying, that I was taking so much time out of my day to help him. And not just to help him, but to be so unpatronizing. I had treated him like he was normal. He said that I made him feel sort of whole again. He made every effort to make it clear he was genuinely, sincerely grateful for how helpful I had been. And I am suddenly reviewing every insult I thought about him. Every time I questioned his mental capacity or quality as a parent, he was so low that what I meant as a mockery and a punishment was, to him, a gift. I made him feel normal. There aren't words for that kind of shame. I thought it was a game. I really did. People still talk about how he touched lives. I know he touched mine. Thank you. Next. I've been doing security for about 16 years now, and about 10 years ago I was doing on again off again shifts at a particular site, not relevant where. Anyway, I had a decent amount of annual leave hours under my belt, so I decided to take a vacation in a city down the coast, visiting a friend. The understanding was that while I was on vacation, my annual leave hours would pay out as if I was still working, but with 17% leave loading, woo. So, about halfway through my vacation, the day after I'm due to get paid, I casually check my account, and the number is nowhere near what it should be. I go okay, maybe they're a day late. 4 days later, after I get home, no improvement. So I ring up work and ask them what's the deal. What I get back is that when I'm on vacation, annual leave pays out on my regular roster hours. But I wasn't getting regular roster hours, so they were paying me for about 1 hour a day, instead of 8. I said, I went on vacation to use up annual leave. They said, well, that's what the rules are. So I stopped taking vacations. My annual leave hours built up, and built up. The company doesn't like anyone holding a huge number of annual leave hours, because if someone decided to quit out of the blue, the payout would be amazing. Saw one guy do this. He had enough hours to take the year off. Then he retired. So about 6 months later they came to me and said, why aren't you taking vacations? I said, I can't afford to. You guys don't pay out my annual leave hours while I'm off. Silence on the other end. Then, we'll see about that. All of a sudden, the policy changed. I took a nice long vacation. Thank you. Next. A few years ago I was working for a company building a specialized electrical switch room for some plant somewhere. The important part to know is that this room had to be fire rated for 4 hours. So if the room was engulfed in fire up to 900 degrees Celsius for 4 hours it wouldn't be breached. The guy running this job was a complete tosspot. In his own words, he was a tradesman, an accountant, an engineer, a truck driver, and had decades of experience. His job title was quotes estimator. Now the client had specs to very specific sealant to be used to seal all of the joints in the room between where the panels joined to one another, and Tosspot had to order this stuff from Germany, and who would have guessed he didn't order enough. We ran out 2/3 heads of the way through the fit out, so he goes down to the local hardware store to get some more. What he came back with was regular heat resistant silicone, the stuff you'd use to glue on an oven door seal that's only rated to 240 degrees Celsius. Not only that, the shit he got is bright red, while the specialized sealant is gray. so it sticks out like dog's balls that it isn't the right stuff just looking at it, but when I pointed it out to him he said just use it, I know what I'm doing and you're only paid from the neck down. So we did what we were told, we squeezed the stuff in nice and thick, sealing the wall panels to the floor. Now this was very early on in the process of building this room. After sealing the walls, another 1 feet 000 odd hours of labor went into installing a few more layers of heat resistant flooring, insulation, doors, high voltage electrical cabinets and the like. Everything glued, welded or otherwise bonded together in a way that's impossible to take apart non-destructively. When the room was finished, the client sent out a few engineers from Japan to do the final ITP, inspection/test procedure. And of course they picked up on the fact that some of the sealant wasn't this fancy stuff from Germany. What sealant is that? We gave you a spec'd product to use. Where is the information on this sealant? The engineer says. Suffice to say we then spend the next 3 months disassembling, more like demolishing, the room, reordering all of the materials, none of which are cheap or off the shelf, over 150k worth in total, and rebuilding the room to spec. Tosspot was fired of course. Thank you. Next. Years ago I worked for a family-run business. I usually worked 40+ hours every week, and when my first check didn't reflect time and a half, I went to the accounting person who informed me that time and a half was not a benefit we offer. Okay, it's a federal law, but whatever. Fast forward months of working for the company, 40+ hours a week. One day I decide to test for a city job. No guarantee I would get it, but it was a full day test on a weekday. I had to ask for a day off. Keep in mind I had only used one vacation day until this point. Being honest, I told them what I needed it for and that I wasn't even sure if I'd get the job. They granted the day. However, when I got back the day after I was fired, I applied for unemployment, as the firing was a surprise. Someone from the unemployment office called to tell me that my request was denied, as my former employer stated I had received warnings. I had not. I replied, interesting, since I have an email from my manager from earlier the week I was fired saying what a great job I was doing and our customers love me, and they don't pay time and a half overtime. Unemployment guy says he'll call me back. On callback he advises he overrode the denial and I would be getting my unemployment and who I should call to file a complaint for the unpaid wages. Didn't think twice. Took all the copies of all my pay stubs and timesheets and filed the complaint. They launched an investigation and he was non-compliant with their requests for a meeting. Got to the point that the investigator just showed up one day and walked into his office. They demanded his books and every employee, past and present for something like 7 years prior, got paid what they were owed, plus he had to pay a penalty, all while another company was in negotiations to merge with his. Thank you. Next. Hi guys. Long time lurker. First post. Wasn't sure as to whether to post or not as it requires a fair bit of background and isn't a short post. Apologies for the length. Second hand, and this happened a long time ago. I was working for the company at the time but had transferred to a different state, but I knew the guys as I used to work with them. It's a story from a previous job in the fuel industry where we were maintaining service stations nationally for major global oil companies. Basically there were 2 types of work. Contract and out of contract work. You basically take on the contract work at a break even. The out of contract work you charge site visit fees, hourly rates, bigger markup, and that is actually where you make your money. This becomes important later. The other thing that is important to the story is that in a service station environment certain work requires permitting, oil company notification and an oil company engineer to attend. This is because flammable environments can exist. There is potential for loss of life and liability wise a contractor such as us was not allowed to work without oil company supervision. The cast. The technician/fitter. We had a great guy working for us. We'll call him Bob. The guy had been in the army for well over a decade. He was a warrant officer, which was basically the highest non-officer rank you could get. He knew his stuff, technically and managerially, and when he left the military and went back to the tools and civilian life, I'd imagine it must have been hard. What I've found with ex-military, especially non-officer people, is that they are big on chain of command and understand how to manage up, as they would often be in the position of trying to get things done without necessarily having the rank to order people to do things. You see this in so many of the officer versus enlisted stories. Maybe I'm wrong and biased, but I have a lot of time for military people. The work coordinator, let's call her Karen, the 20-year-old put into the position had delusions of adequacy. She had no idea of what the jobs entailed, prerequisites, permitting or even the equipment required. So she was put in charge of a team of technicians and fitters. Now her job was to issue the work to the team, meet SLAs for the oil companies and to make sure the team had what they needed, etc. And liaise to get engineers when required. Now if I've been put into a job I know jack about, my approach would be to listen to those doing the work, even try and spend a day on the road and generally be humble enough to know I didn't know it all. Working with your team and they'll help you and cover your back. That wasn't her approach. I didn't see the coordinator role as superior to the guys on the road. I think she did. Needless to say, she didn't endear herself to her team. The incident. As Bob had been there a long time, he generally got a lot of the more complex stuff. Often when Karen rang him and asked him to do a job, he would have to advise her of what needed to happen, what might need hiring, permitting requirements, etc. This may have been frustrating for both parties, but Bob was smart enough to keep things cordial. It might have affected SLAs for Karen, who may have overpromised at times without understanding the complexity of the job. Given he was talked down to a lot, I don't necessarily think her SLAs were his highest priority. Anyway, one day Karen had pissed Bob off and Karen was having a bad day. A job came in that involved welding on a service station. This meant engineers, gas testing, permitting, etc. So Karen rings Bob and issues the job. Bob then says, "You're going to need to." Karen interrupts and says, "Just shut up and go do the job," and slams down the phone. Apparently she then complained, not for the first time, to office colleagues that getting Bob to do anything was really difficult. There was always a complication. So Bob snaps and says, "Fuck it, I will." The aftermath. Now Bob is no idiot. He knew the engineers, knew the process, and I couldn't see him blowing himself up for anyone. So how the relevant oil company engineer accidentally shows up on site as he is about to do work in breach of safety regulations can only be guessed at. The engineer certainly indicated that it was random. So now all hell breaks loose. Upper management are summoned and torn a new arsehole, but that was just the beginning. We are then suspended from setting foot on all of their sites nationwide. All non-contract works are issued to our major competitor, and the contract work, still ours. Problem is that we can't set foot on their sites and still need to meet SLAs. We then have to pay our major competitor to attend the sites, to do our at-cost contract work, at their out-of-contract rates. So I can't remember whether it was 3 or 6 months that we were prevented from going to sites. Certainly it was enough for the message to get though. Well, Karen got her ass kicked severely, but to his credit the boss kinda realized that there was a bit more to work coordination than a cheap 20-year-old could handle. The boss was pissed and lost a hell of a lot of money. Bob wasn't really popular with the boss, but knew he was complying with an order and had nothing on him. Eventually there was a new coordinator appointed. Bob, thank you. Next. Happened about 2 years ago. Friend reminded me of this today. My next door neighbor's house is slightly elevated higher than mine. His gutter is not buried into a drainage system. It floods my side yard when it rains and had progressed to flooding my front yard. I have had nice conversations in the past, but he is totally racist when referring to the people who live across the street, who are wonderful nice people. I approached him about a year ago prior and asked him if we could jointly work on drainage issues. He dismissed me immediately and said, "I don't have any effing money to spend." I said okay, no problem, and let it go for 6 months. I approached him again one day when he was outside and said, "I would like to fix it and I will get 3 estimates on the work and I will pay for it since I am such a nice guy and I had just gotten a bonus at work and I am tired of walking through a mud pit." He didn't say anything and I told him I would get back to him with a plan and need him to sign off for her approval. I am getting estimates around $2,500 to bury his downspouts and tie in drains in the ground and run to a pop-off valves in the back of the house. All 3 estimates wanted to do virtually the same work at around the same cost. So I contact the hoer and put in a request to fix. They then go to him for approval and he says I will not allow him to do the work on my house. Now I am thinking, your water runoff is flooding my yard and you don't want to approve and allow me to pay? The hoer comes back and said we talked to him and he does not want to fix the issue. 90% of the water is coming from his downspout. So here comes the compliance part. I ended up putting in a walkway with shrubs on the side of the house, but that doesn't fix the flooding issue, only helps that I don't have to walk in it. I then filed multiple complaints against my neighbor with the HOA for the damage caused. They sent complaint letters to him telling him if he doesn't fix the problem he will be fined. He had to hire his own company and fix his own drains the exact way that I was going to do them. Then he asked me if I was going to pay, and I smiled and told him to go F off. So neighbor's downspout on house causes my yard to flood. I offered to fix it and pay for it, $2,500. He stupidly said number. He ended up having to pay for the work himself, and the money I would have spent on paying for it went into putting in a walkway and a bunch of other things in my garden. Cheers. Thank you. Next. In 2003, I started working on a new dairy processing plant project in Saudi Arabia. The electromechanical works were done by a British company, who worked from inside the dairy company's plant premises and did not have a valid contracting license to do work in Saudi Arabia. The contract between the dairy company and the electromechanical company was made in the UK, and the EM company worked inside the dairy plant premises as their representatives to avoid legal hassles. I was hired by the EM company through a manpower company, run by a totally shady and creepy dude. At that time, I slightly obese, and in order to cut down my weight, I never had any lunch breaks. I used to work straight from 8 AM to 5 PM, totaling 9 hours. 1 hour additional to the usual 8 hours. I was paid a fixed salary by the manpower company, but they charged the British EM company on an hourly basis, at a very high rate. After 2 months, I learned that they were billing the EM company for my time for 9 hours while they were not paying a corresponding salary to me. I cross-checked with my boss, the project manager at the EM company, and he confirmed. So, I took it up with the shady dude at the manpower company and informed him that if they are billing for 9 hours for me to the client, I should have a corresponding increase in pay. He refused outright. I requested the dude again for a raise, 1 month later, and was refused. Okay. 2 can play the game. I informed the EM company as project manager that henceforth, I will start taking my lunch break, even if I don't eat anything, and they should pay attention to the timesheet the manpower company submits for billing my time. The month comes to an end and the manpower company submits the invoice for my time, with 9 hours marked as daily hours worked, and was rejected outright. The EM company project manager informed the shady dude that they can't bill for time not worked. They came to me. They asked me to work during the lunch breaks and refused outright. They pleaded and I agreed, and they start paying for that additional 1 hour for the past 4 months and for every future month. They had to agree. I went back to working the lunch breaks and I started getting paid for the additional hour too. I made a good amount.